This is Wildlife Biologist with the New Hampshire Fish and Wildlife YouTube channel. This morning I have Dan Bergeron, Wildlife Biologist Dan Bergeron from the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department. And Dan is the deer project leader currently, and we're going to talk about the current New Hampshire deer hunting season. Dan, how's the season going and compared to some years past? And we'll talk about some other things. Well, first of all, Dan, how long have you worked for New Hampshire Fish and Game?
I've been with the department for about 8 years now.
8 years?
Yeah.
I would have never have guessed that. Wow, time goes by fast, doesn't it?
It goes by quick, it sure does.
And you started out before that working on the Moose Project for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
Right here in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
So you've been here a while figuring things out, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've started my career in New Hampshire and a lot of work with Fish and Game. Even when I was getting my graduate degree and undergraduate degree, worked on a number of research projects that the department did in cooperation with UNH. Yep. All
right. Well, so back to the deer season. The current number is?
Yeah, so we're at 12,275 thereabouts. Anytime we end the season at 12,000 deer is a good season, and so the fact that we're there with a couple weeks left is really good. We're about 9% above last year at the same time. We're tracking higher than really any previous year we've seen. We're on track to possibly break the all-time state record.
Which is 14-something, set in 67, wasn't it?
It was, yeah, and it was 1967. And an interesting fact about the difference between the 1967 total and 2018 was the second highest harvest we've ever seen. And this could be the first. And kind of an interesting difference was in 1967, that harvest was composed predominantly of female deer.
Wow.
And now our harvests are composed of predominantly adult males.
What percentage? On an average year?
Yeah, on an average year, probably about 60%.
60%.
Yeah, of adult males as opposed to females. It varies, but it's usually pretty consistent from year to year. Yep. And it varies by management unit based on what our goals and objectives are, if we're looking to increase or decrease the population. Yeah, so big difference. Those were during the times when the state was kind of split north and south, and it was open, closed,
and the season was set by the legislators for decades. A month north and a month south, and it wasn't until I think it was '83 that I think the department finally got control.
Yeah, it was right
of the
around
deer
that
season,
time.
right around there, and that was the first year that was implemented some kind of protection of females, of does. That's why the kill dropped way down, the number way down to around 3,000, or even a little bit under that, maybe.
Yeah, right around there. And and then again, because once the department took over and there was more of a science-based management approach, we've been able to grow that population back substantially. Like you'd referenced, it was slightly over 3,000 deer statewide, and now we're averaging over 11,000 deer. In the last 20 years or so, we've seen pretty much all of the top harvest years have been in about the last 20 years, with the exception of back in 1967, again, when you could harvest pretty much anything you saw.
Half of them were females.
Correct.
And the other big shift I know, back then, a significant portion of the deer were taken in the North Country, Coos County.
Yeah.
That has shifted dramatically, hasn't it?
That has shifted quite a bit. Yeah. So now, I'd have to check, but predominantly the southern part of the state probably produces most of the deer. Although we're seeing increases almost statewide, if not increases, populations are stable. We've been helped out certainly with mild winters, which is good for deer. It's not great for a lot of other species. Moose in particular is a species that's not benefiting from the mild winters, but these mild winters have definitely made things easy for deer. We see lower mortality in the winters, higher productivity. So we actually did a research project that concluded in 2013 looking at productivity of the state's deer herd. We collected roadkill does, aged them, pulled fetuses, got productivity rates, reproductive rates, and we found that over 90% of the females we looked at were pregnant. About 60% of those were pregnant with twins. Now those took place during some relatively mild winters, but it gives an idea how productive the herd is in face of these mild winters.
So what are some of the other things going into setting the deer season and really checking I'll call it checking the pulse of our deer herd? What are some of the factors that go into that?
Yeah, so we have a big game management plan that sets population level objectives in each of the 20 wildlife management units. So the main way we index the deer population numbers is by looking at it's a 2-year average of the adult buck kill. We use adult bucks because harvest rates on adult bucks are more representative of what's actually going on in the population. If you looked at females, you'd see a lot of fluctuation simply because we're adjusting the amount of time that hunters have to pursue those animals. Whereas bucks they're fair game season long, so that's more representative of the population. So we use that as an index to where the population is.
And you were saying there's plenty of older, big bucks in New Hampshire.
There is,
in our population structure.
Yeah, our age structure's pretty good regionally. And that's without having to have any sort of antler point restrictions or any sort of buck age structure management. We have over 50% of our harvest is 2.5-year-olds or older, we've been seeing some really nice mature bucks being taken for a number of years now. I'm surprised every year with some of the photos we've been having bucks harvested in the high 200-pound range. In pretty much every unit in the state on an annual basis.
Yeah, when I put the thing a couple of weeks ago about the bear kill record, Scott Moore, a taxidermist here in New Hampshire, said, well, I took in 3 times the number of bear that I normally do.
Yeah.
And this week he said, I've taken in 3 times the number of deer.
Yeah.
So big bucks are flooding our taxidermists here in the state, giving them lots of work through the winter and into next summer. And so tell us some of the other things the wildlife biologists do. How many deer yards do they check?
Yep.
The biological check stations that they do each fall for 5 days, how many deer are checked there, and some of that work that goes on too.
Deer yard surveys. So deer yard surveys is something that we'll do. That varies depending on the severity of the winter. In the northern part of the state, we'll typically check quite a few more deer yards than we would in the southern part of the state. There's actually been years recently where we haven't had to do any checks in the southern part of the state because we haven't had the conditions that cause deer to yard.
You have to have 18 inches of snow and below a certain temperature or they won't yard up. So,
so in the northern part of the state,
I did that for 30 years myself.
Yeah, in the northern part of the state, we check quite a few on an annual basis. Those will check for things like snow depth, relative number of deer in those yards, the availability of browse in those yards, whether or not we think that there's too many deer and that they're over browsing those areas, if there's any development in the area or forestry operations. And forestry operations can be good, certainly. That's the way we manage deer yards. So they can be good or bad. Obviously, if they're going to go in and just completely remove the yard, that's not something we want to see. But we actively work with landowners and foresters to actively manage deer yards and preserve and manage those.
Been done. I bet that's been done more than 60 years. That started in the 40s, I think.
A long time. And it's we really don't have any regulations in regards to deer yards. We've worked under cooperative agreements with landowners, and it's been working really good for us. Maine did have some regulations, and that kind of had the opposite effect I think they intended in some areas. But our cooperative agreements with landowners have worked relatively well. You referenced biological check stations is another thing biologists will do. We have biologists, typically it's at about 18 stations throughout the state. This year it was a little less because of some staffing shortfalls this year, but on an average year, we usually handle a little over 1,000 deer.
Nice,
We'll get ages based on tooth wear and replacement, field dress body weights, antler beam diameters, and all that information is used to track the health of the deer population by Wildlife Management Unit.
And every couple of years, the seasons are jiggered. They're changed if you need, based on that.
Correct.
The winter conditions, the deer yard checking, the biological health of the deer. So a lot goes into setting a deer season.
A lot goes
every
into
2
it.
years.
Yeah. And
I know I've been retired for 13 years, but sometimes my brain
it never leaves you.
So, we would have meetings with all the conservation officers and get their input. I mean, it's a 6-month-long process.
It's a very long process.
To where it goes to the public.
And we start, as soon as the seasons end, we start tabulating all that data, verifying it, checking it for accuracy. We analyze the data in different ways depending on the species and what the objectives are. Project leaders typically come up with initial proposals. That all goes before the game management team, which is a team of biologists in the department. It goes before, different divisions within the department have input. Then it goes before the commission on a number of occasions for their review and
then to
approval.
the public.
Then to the public. Then back to the commission again. So
it's a long process.
We start at the end of December, and typically rules aren't approved until the following June sometimes.
Yep.
And like you'd referenced, we typically do it on a 2-year basis. Although we haven't had to do this since I've been there, but there are certain years, like with deer, for example, if there's a really severe winter, we might go in an off year to adjust things to compensate for increased mortality. But again, since I've been the deer project leader, winters have been so mild we haven't had to do that.
So I just want to let the hunters know how much work goes into bringing you 12,275 deer in 2020.
It is a
takes
lot of work.
a lot of work over a long period of time. It doesn't happen in 1 year. It happens over decades of learning and adjusting and managing. But we have 100,000 deer, you said, in the state, more than ever before.
Correct. Yeah.
So and a lot of big deer. So Fishing Game is doing an awesome job. Dan, thank you very much. It's appreciated to come out this morning and give us some words of wisdom and some background, and sure appreciate it. And awesome deer season. I haven't been lucky, but others in my family have, so I can open my freezer drawer and there it is.
Well, I've got some left over for now. I haven't gotten one yet either, but I got some left over for next year, so I'm still happy. I've seen a lot of deer, so that's good enough for me.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Dan.
Thanks for having me.